Wow, thank you very much. This is amazing. Thank you all for coming today. First of all, I want to say that I am honored, and we are all honored here on Concordia's campus, to welcome back Tim Goeglein to the campus. He was here back in 2001 when he gave the commencement address and received an honorary doctorate degree. At the time, Tim was Special Assistant to President George W. Bush, serving as Deputy Director at the White House Office of Public Liaison for nearly 8 years. Tim was the President's principal outreach contact for conservatives, think tanks, veterans groups, faith-based groups, and some of America's leading cultural organizations. Tim was instrumental in the creation of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives that serves as a bridge between these organizations and government agencies to increase collaboration among the people and the organizations trying to address some of our world's greatest social service needs. Since 2009, Tim has been Senior Advisor to the President and Vice President for External Relations at Focus on the Family. In this capacity, Tim is the organization's eyes and ears in Washington. Tim is also the author of the political memoir, The Man in the Middle, Faith and Politics in the George W. Bush Era, which was published in 2011. Tim is active on several boards, including the Coalitions for America, the Institute for American Universities, the National Civic Artists Society, the Young Americas Foundation, and the American Conservative Union Foundation. He is also a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a member of the Council for National Policy. Tim has been a deacon at his church in Alexandria, Virginia for the past 25 years, and he also serves on the Sanctity of Life Commission for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He and his wife Jenny and their 2 sons, Tim and Paul, live in Alexandria, Virginia. So please join me in giving a good Concordia welcome to Tim Goeglein. There's some water here for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joyce. I know that if I'm coming to New York from Washington being introduced by a Kennedy, I'm being introduced by the right person. So here's to you. And also to my second favorite president and his wonderful wife. Thank you so much for this great invitation. It's a terrific honor to be here. I'm not the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. It looks like we have standing room only, so I'm trying to solve the mystery. And please feel free to come in to the chapel and make yourself comfortable if you can. I want to start by saying 2 things, if I may, just preliminarily. I arrived at my White House office one morning, and I received a letter from a university I had only faintly heard of, Concordia University, Bronxville, New York. And it was a 3-part invitation. One invitation was to come to the National Arts Club in Manhattan, which turned out to be a very wonderful evening. Secondly, a wonderful personal note from the president of Concordia asking if I would be kind enough, I think were the words, to accept an honorary doctorate, which I'm happy to tell you that I did. But thirdly, which he couldn't have known, he put a line in this letter saying, please come to New York in light of this divisive election, meaning Bush v. Gore, because we in New York are hospitable people, he said, and we would welcome you to Bronxville. Hand over heart, he couldn't have known that just a few months after I was honored to come here for that ceremony, the towers just a few miles from here would come down in one of the most cataclysmic days in American history. I might even say it was the Pearl Harbor of our generation. And I remember meeting with President Bush shortly after 9/11, having a discussion about an unrelated topic, and the idea of New York came up. And little could he have known, little could I have known, but I was happy to say that, Mr. President, I've been to New York fairly recently, and it is peopled by some of the most extraordinary citizens in American history. I feel that more strongly than ever, and I will forever feel that bond connected directly to this very great university in light of that very cataclysmic day. Joyce, may I say, in light of our conversation earlier today, and in light of my conversational topic, I hope, this evening, There was another time where a former U.S. president had received a rather remarkable letter from a very little-known clergyman living in New York City. He was a Lutheran pastor, and as some Lutheran pastors are wont to do, they write letters to the President of the United States, letting them know just what they think. Now, I want to take a step back, if I may. I'm a native of Indiana, but I've lived and worked in Washington, D.C., and in the Commonwealth of Virginia for almost 30 years. And in a panoply of great Americans, there are very few Americans in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia, in the pantheon with George Washington, I might say, that meet this former president I'm telling you about, the architect of the United States Constitution, James Madison, known as Jimmy Madison. And may I say to most of the people in this room, he was called Jimmy as an undergraduate at a university not far from here, Princeton University. He was such an extraordinary student that after 2 years, his principal teacher, the great Scottish clergyman, a Calvinist, Reverend Witherspoon, a signer of both the Declaration and the Constitution, said, "This is such an extraordinary young boy that after 2 years, I have taught him and given him everything I can possibly give." But Witherspoon says, "I have so much more to learn from this boy." And of course, Jimmy Madison went on to become James Madison. As I say, one of our great U.S. presidents and the primary architect of our Constitution. Many years later, after he had written the Constitution, after he had spent a lifetime as Thomas Jefferson's best friend, after he had left the White House, after not one but 2 terms, he woke up one morning and received what he thought to be one of the most important letters he had ever received from this little-known, now largely forgotten, New York Lutheran pastor. And this Lutheran pastor said to the former president, this renowned, world-famous president, this architect and principal author of the most important document for liberty in the history of the world. That's a big statement. He said to this remarkable former president, he said, "I want to explore with you where the kernel of conscience that drives the heart and soul of the Constitution, where did it come from?" May I say, this letter deserves to be framed and placed on your conference room wall. It's an obscure letter. It may not be the most famous one, but I continue to be intrigued every time I come as a Lutheran to New York or New York State of the contents of this letter. Because he says, the pastor says in this letter, "I've delivered a sermon, and in my sermon," and I'm paraphrasing, "in my sermon, I've come to the conclusion that in the way that Providence has organized the world, we have kingdoms in conflict. We have the state, and we have government. We have the realm of reason. We have the realm not of the church, not of revelation, but of the governance of mankind, the kingdom of the left." And yet he says in this same letter to the late, great Madison, but there's another kingdom. This, he says, is the kingdom of the right, the kingdom of the church, the kingdom of conscience, the kingdom of the church and religion, the kingdom of faith. May I say to all of you, though this may have been a very great pastor, it was not in any way a unique theology or a unique philosophy. this little-known Lutheran pastor was giving voice to precisely and exactly the heart of the Reformation, the kingdoms in conflict, the very reason that Luther himself felt that there was a kingdom of the left and a kingdom of the right. Let's remember that before there was a Martin Luther, there was another remarkable theologian who some of you know I'm going to name, and that is St. Augustine. Remember, Martin Luther himself was one of the most important Augustinian monks of world history. And he had imbibed and absorbed this remarkable theology of the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God. In other words, every single soul who is sitting or standing in this chapel tonight is dual at the same time, a citizen of the left and a citizen of the right. We are citizens of a country. We are citizens of a political order. We are citizens by conscience in that order, and we are from the, I might say, the compulsion of citizenship, we are compelled to act in the kingdom of the left. This is the kingdom of public policy. It is the public arena. It's not just the place where mayors and governors and members of the House and Senate and City Council duel and battle it out, but it's the place where citizens like you and like me come to bring our voice and our role and our duty as citizens to the country, culture, and civilization where God Almighty has placed us. But at the same time, at precisely the same time, in a way that is, in one sense, a total mystery, we are also citizens inside the church, citizens inside of a synagogue, citizens in another house of worship. And in this kingdom of the right, we have the kernel of the genius of America. The genius of America, and I know where I'm standing, is not Wall Street. May I say, the genius of America is not our military. Yes, we have the strongest military in the history of mankind, which is a big statement when you live in the shadow of the Romans and the British Empire. And yes, we have the largest economy in world history. To give you a minute example, Russia's economy is 1/15 the size of the American economy. But in the kernel of American genius is your conscience, and yours, and yours, and yours. And by the right of the Constitution, no government, no individual, no one on Wall Street or Hollywood and Vine, no institution in Washington or in Albany can ever compel you against your conscience in the United States of America. If America lasts 1,000 years, this is what America will be remembered for most. It is impossible to internalize the genius and the creation of America absent the right of conscience, which comes from religious liberty. Now, I want to ricochet for a moment, because what I am about to suggest is a very big suggestion. In the founding of this country, there was no single source, not one, that was more influential on the founding of the United States of America than the King James Version of the Bible, seconded only perhaps by the Book of Common Prayer. I'm raising my right hand. Please do not take my word for it. History is a very great teacher. And in the founding of the United States of America, at the Constitutional Convention, and in those 35 years, which are broadly defined as the founding generation, there was no single source, not one, that came close to influencing and impacting the founding fathers and mothers of America than the King James Version of the Bible. In fact, in common talk, when they went into the pubs, when they went into the restaurants, onto the farms, and in the backwoods of some of our most densely populated, by trees, not people, parts of the United States of America, the discussion of the Bible and the influence of the Bible. I mean common talk, the way that we talk about who is president and who has the #1 musical hit of this week and what is the top Hollywood box office moment and what's happening on the cloud and et cetera, et cetera. In that kind of common conversation, the founding fathers and mothers of America were totally and completely conversant in the Judaic-Christian tradition. Here's something that's even a finer point on that pencil. The most influential book of the Bible on the founding of America was the Book of Deuteronomy. Whether you were the most liberal person at the founding or the most conservative person at the founding, you profoundly understood the nature of the exceptional provision of a country, that Providence had selected certain peoples and certain countries out of all of human history for a special role and a special task. This is what our founders believed. By the way, not just the founders who happened to be Christians. Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. John Adams was not a Christian. They were Christological in their conception of this constitutional republic. There were great Christians at the founding. I mentioned Witherspoon. Rush is another. There are many others. But it was in the ethos and in the marrow and DNA of the pre-founding and founding of this country that there was a direct application of the Ten Commandments and the Beatitudes for purposes of conscience as to what constituted a constitutional republic. Now I want to take one step further about the direct application of what I'm talking about. At our founding, whether you were Jefferson or Adams, gigantic rivals on the biggest issues of the founding. Should there be a permanent currency? Half the founders said no. Should we have a standing army? 1/3 of the founders said no. Should we have a strong central national government? 1/4 of the founders were convinced that we shouldn't. You've heard of George Mason and Patrick Henry, perhaps? They felt so strongly in opposition to a national government that they left the Constitutional Convention and wrote and spoke against the Constitution. This is how divisive parts of the founding were. But I want to share tonight at Concordia what our founding fathers and mothers did not disagree upon. And it's one big thing. They learned it principally from the ancient Romans and the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Greeks. Are you ready for this? You cannot have freedom and liberty without virtue. I want to say it idiomatically. They said that in the American experience, you could not have liberty and virtue sustained over time through many years or decades unless you had moral excellence in the people and in the leaders. So what was the motivation of our founding fathers and mothers for a high degree of conscience and religious liberty? They wanted a very large, nourishing base for whatever gives you moral excellence in the people and in the leaders. And in the American experience, they said that came from religion. They learned, by the way, this was not a theoretical discussion in any classroom. Our founding fathers and mothers learned from lived experience that the most free country in the history of the world, up to and including what we would say is the early part of the British Empire, was the Roman Republic. And our founding fathers and mothers knew their history. They knew what happened, that you could lose liberty in a republic, and that just like you snap your fingers, within a few short years, you and you and you and you and you and you could cease to be a citizen and become a subject. That republics became empires incrementally. So our founding fathers and mothers asked themselves, what prevents that possibility? What gives you the greatest likelihood for freedom and liberty across time? And they went back to a large swath for the church, a large swath for the synagogue. By the way, if any of you come to Washington any time in the next 6 months, at the Smithsonian Institution, there is a phenomenal display on American religion, and in one of the most remarkable letters I've ever read, there is a letter from George Washington to the first and oldest synagogue in the United States celebrating religious liberty as it connects directly to citizenship. Now, if I may say, for most of American history, and you all know probably what I'm going to say, this principle of religious liberty and conscience has sometime been widely misapplied. And I don't need to tell you that in the 21st century, the questions of character, virtue, moral excellence, goodness, charity, the promulgation of the beautiful, the just, and the true in the public square is under fire as never before. I know I have some new friends, some sisters who are visiting this evening. You honor me and you honor us with your presence. I would like to share a real story, if I may. There was a group of nuns who came to Focus on the Family in about 2009. They are called the Little Sisters of the Poor. And the Little Sisters of the Poor have a fairly small chapter in Denver, Colorado, not far from Focus on the Family in Colorado Springs. Now, may I say, this order of nuns is one that everybody in this chapel should know about tonight if you don't know about them. Because their vocation, their reason for being, their vision, their mission, is to provide love and sanctity and nourishment and medicine to the indigent poor who have been utterly and totally abandoned by life. Very close to the Focus on the Family office in Washington, near to Catholic University, is one of the Washington establishments of the Little Sisters of the Poor. And when they came to Focus to tell us about their work, I was very eager to go see what they do. And the first person I met was a woman who was 93 years old at the time, suffering deeply from dementia. She had no idea who she was. She had no idea who anybody was. And when she was found by the Little Sisters of the Poor, she was living in utter and complete squalor. I'm sorry to confess that she was surrounded by vermin and barely eating. It was a remarkable moment to meet not just this woman, but to meet the sisters who had taken a vow of poverty and spent their lives giving dignity and sanctity and God's love and grace and mercy and compassion to literally thousands of people like this around the country. One day, utterly out of the blue, the head of this order received a letter. The letter was that the Little Sisters of the Poor, by the dictate of the federal government, must begin, not may begin, but must begin to order and to allow abortifacients as part of its health care plan. Now, I don't mind telling you that the sisters immediately thought there is some problem here, because surely the federal government is not ordering an order of nuns to offer access to abortifacients as part of its health care plan. And I want to pause here for a moment, because I know that even in the chapel tonight, there are people here who are pro-life, like I am, and there are people here tonight who are not pro-life, and there are people here tonight who are deciding, and that's perfectly fine. But for purposes of this order, the nuns went to the administration and said essentially, we're almost certain that there is a disjunction here between the federal legislation and what we're being asked to do. I'm very sorry to tell you all that after an innumerable number of lawsuits that went all the way to the highest point of our appellate judicial system, the nuns were left with the diktat, the compulsion against their conscience and religious liberty to order this procedure as part of their health care plan or face ruination. I'm very happy to tell you all that perhaps by a stroke of providence and against all odds, the Supreme Court of the United States of America picked up this case. And I remember sitting in the courtroom for this case. And, to quote Wellington speaking to Queen Victoria, it was a close-run thing, because the Supreme Court decided by a 5-4 decision, not in favor of the nuns, but a fuzzy enough decision that gave them the wherewithal to continue their work and to essentially live to fight another day in court. Another case from this state, the little town of Greece, New York. It's actually a village. If it has a stoplight, I'm not sure. It's very tiny. And the city council of this village invites local clergymen and clergywomen to come into the city council and to offer a prayer before a city council meets. And the only stipulation is that you have to be a religious entity within the confines of Greece, New York. You probably know what I'm going to say. There were limitations to who could be invited simply because there was not a raft of every possible faith in this village of Greece, New York. But this city council, over several years, did a fabulous job of inviting as many groups and denominations as they could. They were sued. They were sued. And I'm also loath to tell you that these cases went all the way to the top of the appellate chain until, semi-miraculously, the Supreme Court once again took the case. There's another case that you should know about. A case of a Lutheran school. Lutheran schools, like Catholic schools, like Jewish schools, like Islamic schools, under the rights of the Constitution, they may hire and fire, as they will, their headmaster or headmistress, their teachers, their principals, etc. This is called a call. This is the heart of conscience for the calling of a rabbi, the calling of the imam, the calling of a priest, the calling of the religious, the calling of a teacher. This is foundational, literally, in almost every American synodical, denominational, and independent religious institution in the United States of America. And this very small school decided that it had to let go a particular teacher. It was fully constitutional, fully under the right of the incorporated business plan of this very highly regarded Christian school. But the state felt that it had the constitutional right to tell a school, a Christian school in this instance, that it did not have the right to hire and fire its own faculty. Yes, you're right, an assault on their conscience. Let me tell you, I would like to come to Concordia tonight. I am a hopefulist to the core. I am an unbridled optimist by nature. And I would like to be able to share in this community that religious liberty and conscience rights are in better shape than they've ever been in American history. But that is not the case. Incrementally, inch by inch, there is a move in our remarkable and extraordinary country to privatize faith and to wall faith in and to say, if you keep it within the four walls of your church, chapel, temple, synagogue, you're fine. If you keep your discussion of your faith and the application of your faith to public policy in the public arena inside those walls, you're fine. But if you bring it out into the public square, be prepared to be part of the plaintiff litigant culture that is becoming common in the American experience. And I want to close with an example that seems so absurd that it sounds as if I am making this up, but I think it goes to the heart of faith in the halls of power and what men and women who are serious about our faith and serious about our conscience and its application, not just in the private sphere, but in the public sphere, and how we navigate these questions, where we find ourselves. There is a very small preschool in a very rural part of the Midwest. And this preschool applied for a state grant. And in this particular Midwestern state, the state takes old rubber tires, shreds them into 1,000,000 pieces, and gives them to preschools to put on the playground so that the little tykes don't scratch their knees. By the way, it's a very popular program. And there is a Lutheran church in this tiny part of an otherwise large state which applied for this grant. The preschool serves any child who comes in the door, Lutheran, Catholic, Jewish, or no religious faith whatsoever. Everybody is welcome in this preschool. And one day, it often happens by mail, the headmaster of this preschool received a letter from the person in this particular state capital saying, "We rank all of your applications, and your application figured in the top 10. You meet all the requirements. You are," I'm paraphrasing, "exactly the kind of school we serve. But we're not giving any grants to any preschools that are funded by churches or other religious institutions, because we believe in a wall between church and state." I want to raise my right hand and be very clear. If this preschool were applying for money for a missions program, or the purchasing of Bibles, or the purchasing of crucifixes for the wall, or the repair of the stained glass in the chapel, or the purchasing of chalices or candles, or the other things that are demonstrably part of the kingdom of the right, it would be utterly unconstitutional. And every Christian and every Jew and every Muslim in America should be first in line to say that is not the role of the state. But it is the role of the state to, broadly speaking, welcoming in the power and the influence and the goodness and the contributions of the faith-based community. In fact, I'll close by sharing an anecdote. And I want to use New York City as only one example of many. If tomorrow every religious institution in New York City decided that it would no longer participate in the public square by any contribution that it makes because of its ministry in healthcare, in feeding programs, in transportation, in wellness programs, in schools, preschools. I want to go on and on. I want to include into my anecdote every single possible example of the charitable work that it does. If tomorrow in New York City, every one of those missions were to be closed, and I'm not overstating it, the social structure of New York City would collapse overnight. That's true in my city of Washington, D.C. It's true in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Newark, and the smallest town or village that any of us could imagine. This is how, in the deepest recesses of our American DNA and marrow, faith and religion have become a part of the latticework of the tapestry of America. There is, in other words, a practical application of faith in the public square, and a reason that it is good for our constitutional republic, which is also a religious republic, to find a large swath for people of conscience and people of all faiths to not be allergic to the need for virtue and the application of moral excellence in the public square. We need it in the cities, we need it in the counties, and we need it in our national government. I must tell you again, I'm a hopefulist to the core. And despite the fact that we are at a very difficult time in the United States of America, I believe strongly that the best years for our great country are ahead of us. And I'm particularly heartened that on the topic of faith in public life, that there are a few souls who came together tonight who wanted to hear from one poor miserable sinner. Thank you all very much. Now, I would be very happy to answer or duck a few questions, and this does not strike me as a shy bunch. Some of you may agree, some of you may disagree. I'd love to hear whatever's on your mind. Any questions that you might have on faith, politics, public policy, any topic whatsoever. And someone has to be brave enough to go first. Yes?
As a conservative, how do you balance the lack of goodness, charity, Christian values, anything that we see in New York at least, we see it, I think, coming out of the White House? How do you balance that with the demands of our faith, but also of our world?
I am, yeah, may I say, I'm very pleased that that is the first question. As I was saying to the, yes, sure. He's asking about the application of faith and character in the era of President Trump. And may I say, I was sharing with the driver today, who was driving me from the airport, this idea that in the history of our country, there have only been two presidents born in New York City. Donald Trump, who was born in Queens, and Theodore Roosevelt, who was born on what was then the Lower East Side. By the way, ironically, two of them from the wealthiest presidencies that we've ever had. And the day that Theodore Roosevelt was born, his grandfather was probably the wealthiest man in America. I'll tell you how I think we ought to think about it. I believe that character is fate. When you walk into the museum at Mount Vernon, which was the home of our first president, George Washington, unanimously elected to two presidencies, unanimously chosen to be our first general in the American Revolution, unanimously chosen to be the president of the Constitutional Convention, right? You learn all about the life of this rather extraordinary human being. But you would miss entirely the story of George Washington if you missed the centrality in his own life, his view that virtue was the destiny of every man and every woman. I was saying earlier to a friend of mine, I've been in Washington long enough to know that, and I know that I'm at the seat of a great institution of higher learning. And I hope everybody in here is a straight A student. But in the eventuality that you're not, may I share something that I've learned? I've learned that this remarkable country is run by B and C level students. But the ones who rise to the top and flourish over time are the ones whose characters are unblemished. That's what I believe. I believe that with Washington and with the ancients, that character is destiny. You remember this remarkable passage in Scripture where Jesus is essentially shown a coin. And the coin that he is shown has the visage of the most powerful man in all of Western civilization to that point, Julius Caesar. And this man says to Jesus, how do you delineate? Back to where I began my remarks tonight. What is God's and what is man's? And he says, render unto Caesar, right? That which is Caesar's, and unto God which is God's. I believe the state serves us best when it's peopled with men and women of high character, and I believe the church serves us best when it's peopled with men and women of highest character. That's not to say that policies don't matter. They do. It's not to say that personnel doesn't matter. I've learned in Washington that personnel is policy. But character always matters. Just ask Theodore Roosevelt. Great. Thank you. Another question? Yes, sir.
As one who has been in circles of faith in Washington, D.C. for the last couple of decades, it seems to me as an outsider that the climate of faith has become more politicized. As I read history from the 60s and the 70s, you had people coming across the political divides to do Bible studies together and to pray together. Is that still going on today? And if not, how do we recapture the sense that faith transcends politics?
That's also an extraordinary question in light of the one that was asked a moment ago. I am absolutely certain that in the time that I've been in Washington, which is nearly 3 decades, I've never known a time when Republicans and Democrats, by the dictates of their faith, have spent more time together in faith, in prayer, in Bible study than now. The National Prayer Breakfast is the largest annual gathering of people of faith in Washington. Since the era of President Eisenhower, and it takes place every February, there are about 10 to 11,000 people who come to the National Prayer Breakfast. And each year the roster, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, who take part in the weekly Bible studies on Capitol Hill has grown and grown and grown. And I know it sounds like bad manners in one sense, but back to where I started, I think that the headlines that we read about the historic levels of toxicity and division, I don't think they're completely accurate. If I were in New York City 2 months before the Civil War, let's pretend that I'm meeting everybody tonight in 1859. I can't imagine a more divisive moment in America than 1859. Let's remember, 1/10 of our presidents have been assassinated. 1/10. And if you include into that level the number of presidents who have had assassination attempts, it more than doubles. So we've had incredible periods of massive division in this country. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that when you read Lincoln's second inaugural, when you read Dr. King's I Have a Dream, that these are bookends to the way that a healthy religiosity can help heal the fissures and the brokenness in the country. Both of those men paid dearly by their lives. After the Civil War, we had 750,000 Americans who had died as a result. And Reconstruction was coming, which wasn't very pretty, followed by Jim Crow. But I feel confident that America's climate of faith helped heal those wounds. And I believe now more than ever, we need Christian universities, we need churches, pastors, priests, religious, to step up into the public square and to help offer a balm of healing to our country. I think there's a historic opportunity to do that. Civility is a necessity in a constitutional republic. And civility and magnanimity and grace can come from the right sources. That's what I believe. Yes. Another question? Yes.
Quick question. You talked about, you gave an example of the Lutheran preschool that applied for the grant
Yes.
and did not get it because they were run by a faith-based institution.
Right.
Since you were one of the key architects of the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, could you give an example of one of what you thought might have been one of the, examples of a good time when,
Yes.
when there was that kind of bridge was there
Yes.
between government funding and faith-based or community initiatives.
Yes, if I had 9 hours, and praise God I don't, I could give you lots of great examples. Of course, yeah. And I'm going to give you just one. It's called the Fishing School, and it's in Southeast Washington, D.C., which is a very tough neighborhood. At the time, it was a small, fledgling ministry. At the time, they didn't even have a computer. They had no front office. I think they were using an IBM Selectric to write applications, right? But this particular ministry, which served young boys who had come up in the most broken culture you can imagine, was doing remarkable things, and it was a Christian ministry. And I remember going with the president into Southeast Washington, D.C., to learn about this remarkable ministry. This ministry had never applied for a federal grant. This ministry probably had never thought to do so. But I'll tell you, what they were doing economically with great efficiency was nothing short of astonishing. And the federal government partnered with the fishing school, and today, more than 80% of the young boys who came into that program, troubled in the ages of 5th, 6th, and 7th grades, have graduated from high school and are on their way to college. We are all dominated by the social media. We're all dominated by this kind of dour, downcast, daily narrative of all the problems. And I think sometimes that when we're placed in that kind of valley, we don't have the benefit and blessing of seeing the remarkable things that every day people of faith are doing in their cities and in their cultures. There are literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of good news stories, but they get drowned out by the bad news stories. C.S. Lewis has that wonderful turn of phrase, where the goal in the Christian life is to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. And I think that all of us are duty-bound to look for those remarkable small ministries and faith-based groups. They may not be the most famous ones, they probably aren't, that are doing remarkable ministry in the neighborhoods where God has placed them. And there, by the way, are hundreds of them in New York City. I'm very happy to say. Yes. Another question? Yes.
What would you say to thank you very much for being here this afternoon.
My honor.
It's been illustrious. What would you say to young people who, some of whom may be thinking that politics is going to be the kind of career they'd like to try, and how would they go about applying for an internship in Washington?
If I could leave this chapel with one plea, despite the vocations that all the young people are feeling or the tug toward a particular profession, the one plea that I would have is that every young person in this chapel would spend even a sliver of their life in public policy and in the public square, regardless of where God's calling you, regardless of what vocation you're being called to. Life in the public square is very important. Getting into the process of seeing how a campaign is run, how a bill is written, how a policy starts as an idea and becomes a law, whether it's in the judicial branch, the legislative branch, the executive branch, whether it's the city or town council, whether it's state government. You know, public policy has gotten a bad rap, a very bad rap. And I think that's very unfortunate. I spent about 19 years of my professional life working at senior levels in the federal government. And I have had 30 years of interns. And some of these interns have gone on to become doctors or lawyers or nurses or pastors or missionaries or engineers or whatever. But I think they're better as people. And we're all better in the Commonwealth because they've spent part of their time in public service. And may I tell you, to your last point, internships are relatively easy to apply for and relatively easy to get. That's a big statement, but they are. Whether it's in the House or in the Senate, whether it's in your state House and Senate, whether it's locally here, we are hungry for young people of both political parties, of both political persuasions, to get involved. And it's a matter of taking the first step. And I'll tell you one thing, I wrote this down actually before I came, which is that it's so easy to spend your life investing in the things that we all think are so important at the moment, but they're not. And it's far more important to invest your time, whether you're being paid or not, to invest your life in the things that are meaningful, because they come back to you over and over and over again. And being inside the public square and seeing how a country and a culture and a civilization is organized, how it's governed, how you're sometimes in the minority and you're sometimes in the majority, how you can win with magnanimity and lose with magnanimity. I think this is very, very important. And we've never needed young people in the public square more than now at every level. I remind people, it's not Wall Street's country, it's not the military's country, it's not Hollywood's country, it's not Washington's country, it's your country. We the people. We the people. Self-government is the center of the project, animated by conscience and the religious liberty that I talked about. You bet. I'll say thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.